What's up, heathens? How ya doing? I'm the Godless Engineer, and I critically analyze apologists' claims to give you the best arguments and information so that you can stand up and use your voice. Today, we're going to be taking another look at red pen logic. This channel is run by Tim Barnett, who works for Stand to Reason. Today, he's throwing shade at mythicism.
If you close your eyes to the evidence, then you won't be able to see it. But that doesn't mean it's not there. Maybe you just need to open your eyes. This is Red Pen Logic with Mr. B, where we help you assess bad thinking by using good thinking. Plus, we try to have some fun in the process. In today's tweet, Eater makes the incredible claim that there is no documentation for Jesus' existence except for the Bible. Just saying. The implicit assumption is that if the Bible is the only historical documentation we have for Jesus existing, then we don't have good reason to believe he actually existed. What color pen should we use today? Just kidding.
Did you just throw all those pens at a cat? What kind of dick are you there, Tim? I'm just kidding. But yes, essentially, the only documents that we have that attest to Jesus even existing in the early first century is the Bible. Well, specifically the individual books that are in the Bible. We've got Paul's writings, who are in fact the first writings about Jesus, and then we have the Gospels, which really it's just one gospel, Mark, and Mark's gospel influenced all the other gospels. But even still, even if we just had one document that reliably admitted that Jesus existed in history, that would be enough to just assume that Jesus existed in history. But does the Bible actually do this? Does Paul's writings actually admit to Jesus being here on earth? I don't think they do, but we're going to see what Tim has for us today to prove that Jesus existed on earth. If you want to know how he does that, then please stay tuned. Alright, before we begin Tim's video today, I do want to remind you guys about the Crestus app. If you want to get peer-reviewed information on early Christianity and how Jesus probably didn't exist in history, then definitely check out the Crestus app on your respective app store. I only ever use peer-reviewed information in the app, so you can be sure that you have the best information about early Christianity and whether or not Jesus existed. So go on ahead and check that app out today. All right, so let's go ahead and take a look at Tim's video.
You may be surprised to hear that there are some people who think Jesus never existed. They believe Jesus is a mere myth with no historical evidence to back him up. This, my friends, is simply false.
Oh shit, is it? I would be happy to know what kind of evidence do you have. I mean, I've already laid out how Paul's writings are the most independent sources that we could have for Jesus. So I'm kind of wondering, what kind of documentation do you have to support this idea that Jesus did exist in history? Hopefully you'll bring up some good ones that I haven't heard of yet. That'll make me think, maybe I should reconsider my mythicism. You know what? I should just go ahead, go to my app and take it down now before y'all buy it.
And it's not only false, it's foolish. At least that's the word that world-class Bible scholar and agnostic skeptic Bart Ehrman uses to describe what he calls Jesus' mythesis.
Oh my God, not Bart Ehrman. So are you literally going to lead off with a appeal to authority right off the bat? Are you serious? Fuck me.
So why don't you take it from here, Bart?
I think that atheists have done themselves a disservice by jumping on the bandwagon of mythicism, because, frankly, it makes you look foolish to the outside world. If that's what you're going to believe, you just look foolish.
But Bart, is there any historical evidence for Jesus' existence?
You know, I'm really not all that convinced by Bart Ehrman just berating the mythicism position. I don't know why anybody would consider this all that convincing. I'm more convinced by the evidence, which he just brought up, like, well, what evidence is there? And so I'm wondering if Bart actually talks about real evidence that supports Jesus existing in history. Bart Ehrman's book, Did Jesus Exist? And his whole position on Jesus existing is very notable for being just the poorest argument to establish that Jesus existed in history. It's ripe with Christian bias all throughout it. He uses the same bad arguments that all of the other Christian New Testament scholars and all that use it. Like, they're exactly the same. It's bad. They don't support the conclusion, but everybody always turns to him, which technically, I don't know if you guys know this, but Bart Ehrman's not a historian. He's a textual critic.
I mean, okay, yeah. I mean, I have a whole book on it.
So there's a little bit of evidence.
There is a lot of evidence. I mean, there is so much evidence.
Like how much evidence?
It is not, I mean, I know in the crowds you all run around with, it's commonly thought that Jesus did not exist.
There's just so much evidence, I can't even name one thing that is included in this mountain of evidence that we have for Jesus. Really? If I say that there's substantial amount of evidence for evolution, I have a list of things that I can point to. Like like chromosome 2 in human beings, or the fossil record, or all of the experiments that we've been able to do on how features propagate throughout a group of organisms. Or we could point to, those finches on the Galapagos, or we could point to any number of things. We can point to physiological similarities between living animals now, and we can see evolution. When I say that there's a lot of evidence for evolution, I'm saying that I can name off multiple different things. But it kind of seems right here like Bart's just like, there's so much evidence out there. I just don't even know I can't even pluck one particular source out of my fucking cranium right now. There's so much evidence.
Let me tell you, once you get outside of your conclave, there's nobody this is not even an issue for scholars of antiquity.
But surely there must be some scholars of antiquity who doubt Jesus' existence.
Well, there are scholars that doubt. There are experts with degrees in relevant fields. I probably got like a picture from my app up here of all of the experts that we have in that have degrees in relevant fields that doubt the historicity of Jesus. So when we talk about experts in the field, or these scholars that like Bart Ehrman is talking about, how no scholars of antiquity like doubt the historicity of Jesus, what he's talking about here are Christian historians and New Testament scholars. Those are the people that he's talking about here. Now, there are outliers like Bart Ehrman and other atheist scholars out there that do think that Jesus existed in history. But the overwhelming majority of people in this particular section of historians and scholars of antiquity are primarily Christians that are primarily bound by dogmatic statements they had to sign when they either graduated from their divinity schools or when they went to go and teach for a theological or divinity school.
There is no scholar in any college or university in the Western world who teaches classics, ancient history, New Testament, early Christianity, any related field, who doubts that Jesus existed.
Well, yeah, that's because, his ahistoricity has not been established yet. I mean, in the early 20th century, they didn't start teaching that Abraham and Noah didn't exist just because they were starting to doubt whether or not they did exist. It wasn't until their ahistoricity was reliably established in the consensus that they started teaching it. So to use the consensus to prove that there's no reason to doubt the consensus is a circular fucking argument.
But Bart, what are the reasons that scholars give for Jesus' existence?
The reason for thinking Jesus existed is because he is abundantly attested in early sources.
All right, please name those early sources, and I will tell you how they do not establish that he existed.
That's why.
So here's the question. Why don't these scholars doubt the existence of Jesus like so many skeptics do? Because of evidence, like the records of 2nd century Roman historian Cornelius Tacitus, who's one of the best historians of antiquity. In his last major work titled Annals, Tacitus records how Nero, concerned about rumors that he secretly burned Rome, shifted the blame to Christians. Therefore, to put down the rumor, Nero substituted as culprits and punished in the most unusual ways those hated for their shameful acts, whom the crowd called Christians. The founder of its name, Christ, had been executed in the reign of Tiberius by one of the procurators, Pontius Pilate.
Tacitus. Thank you for bringing up that particular piece of evidence that I've covered multiple times here on the channel. Essentially, what you can boil it down to is that Tacitus does not originally say Christus, he says Crestus. So it's Christians and Crestus. But even if you assume that he meant Christus, which he wouldn't have written Crestus if he wanted to write Christus, that's a totally different discussion that we'll probably have sometime in the future. But even if you take it at face value, that just places Christians in Rome in 64 AD. And that's all that it does. It does not prove that Jesus existed in history. Tacitus is not providing us any information that is separate from Christians that were existing in the 2nd century, which is when Tacitus was writing. Plus, Tacitus could have gotten his information from Pliny the Younger in the next province. He was interrogating Christians and learning about their faith and practices. So, obviously, Tacitus could have gotten the information from Pliny, and that would have informed him about who the Christians were. Now, Pliny had a father or uncle named Pliny the Elder, who, if the Christians were a major thing when he was living, he would have definitely informed Pliny the Younger about the Christians. But as we can tell with Pliny's writings, he didn't know anything about the Christians. And this was the 2nd century in which both Tacitus and Pliny were writing. So no, Tacitus doesn't prove that Jesus existed in history. That is one of the worst pieces of evidence that you can bring up.
Or consider the evidence of 1st century Jewish historian Flavius Josephus. He mentions Jesus twice in his Jewish Antiquities, once in Book 18 and once in Book 20, where he describes the killing of James, the leader of the Jerusalem church, whom Josephus calls the brother of Jesus, who is the Messiah.
Well, Josephus is kind of a complicated thing. Like you said, there's 2 different verses. The first one is actually a complete insertion by a later Christian scribe. We don't know who it was, but it was more than likely either Eusebius or Eusebius's mentor. Either one of those guys inserted that in there. There's multiple different ways that we can prove that entire passage is not Josephine. Whether you want to go to Paul Hopper and show how the verb usage within that paragraph is nothing like what Josephus uses, or if you want to go to Alice Wheely, who definitely proved that the Eusebian text is the only text that we have ever had, and that any other redacted version that does exist ultimately stems from the Eusebian version. So that is as far as we can tell, the original version of that passage. To suggest that any redacted version of it existed is pure speculation with no evidence to support it. Now, this second passage that he mentioned here is more than likely a scribal interpolation, most likely a marginal note or something that was done unintentionally. Because later on in that same section, the high priest position is actually given to Jesus ben Damnius. We don't know where this Jesus ben Damnius came from or why he's important to the story. But if originally the Jesus that's referenced to as the one they called Christ was actually labeled as Jesus ben Damnius up there, or in some other fashion that doesn't include who was called Christ, then that entire passage makes a lot more sense. It's much more parsimonious to consider the Jesus at the start of the paragraph to be a ben Damnius and for the interpolation to happen than it is to assume that this is the Christ, because there's no explanation whatsoever as to what a Christ is. If you assume that the Testimonium Flavianum was originally in Josephus, then there should be a reference right here back to that particular section of that book, but we don't find that whatsoever. And Josephus does not explain in the text right there what a Christ is. For the audience that he's writing to, he would need to do these things. So it just literally makes no sense for that particular passage to exist as it does. So no, Josephus does not show that Jesus existed in history.
Then there's the evidence from the 2nd century Greek satirist Lucian of Samosata. Though he doesn't specifically name Jesus, he clearly refers to Jesus with contempt as a crucified sophist whom the Christians worshipped as a god.
Lucian is really poor evidence. And I mean, even Robert Van Voorst would tell you the exact same thing. Because when Lucian was writing was so far into the 2nd century that he was more than likely influenced by 2nd century Christians at the time. So he was definitely influenced by already established Christian traditions. That means that it's not an independent source. So no, Lucian does not prove that Jesus existed in history.
So it's simply not true that there's no historical documentation of Jesus' existence outside the Bible. There's lots of it, coming from nearly 20 secular sources.
Oh, can you name all those 20 secular sources? Because I'd love to hear what you consider to be evidence. I've looked at all of these extra biblical sources. None of them are independent of 2nd century Christians or the Gospels themselves.
But there's another problem with this tweet. What about the historical evidence inside the Bible? Eater assumes that the biblical evidence doesn't count as actual evidence. Since the biblical documentation for Jesus must be biased, the argument goes, it cannot be a reliable source of historical information.
No, that's not the argument against using the biblical documents. The biblical documents, let's just take like the Gospels and all of the other biblical documents other than Paul's writings. You take those, and they are definitely influenced by Paul's writings. They are representative of already established Christian thought. And this already established Christian thought is definitely based on Paul's writings. Now, that doesn't mean that Paul invented Christianity. What it means is that the Gospels and what we have come to know as Christianity is Paul's Christianity. In the Bible, the only independent source that we have is Paul's writings. Now, that would be really good evidence to say that Jesus existed in history, with the exception that Paul never really places Jesus on earth. He only writes about Jesus appearing to him in visions after his supposed death. He never indicates anybody knew Jesus while he existed on earth, so it's really hard to say or justify that Jesus really did exist on earth, and Paul shows that. Paul separates himself from any human sources. He says that he only got his information from visions and from the scripture. Now, obviously, there were Christians existing prior to Paul because those were the people that Paul was persecuting. Just because Paul didn't invent Christianity like wholesale doesn't mean that Paul didn't put a spin on Christianity or reinterpret some ideas about Christianity. Plus, there were a lot of different ideas going around in the 1st century about this savior of the Jewish people. And we find that in various places, like in 2 Peter. That's an entire book that's a forged account of a historical meeting with Jesus. And they say in the preamble of 2 Peter that they do not believe in cleverly devised myths, that they have actually seen Jesus. Why would you have to make up a physical meeting of Jesus if there were actually people that met Jesus? So yeah, the argument isn't that, oh, the Bible's biased, therefore you can't use it as evidence. That's not the argument. The argument actually is that Paul's writings, the only independent sources that are within the Bible, do not account for a physically existing earthly Jesus. And so therefore do not establish that Jesus existed in history.
In other words, if we want real evidence, then we have to look elsewhere. Well, we did look elsewhere and we came up with some pretty cool stuff. But why not count the Bible as real evidence? Here's why you should. The Bible isn't just an individual book that can be dismissed because it's not just an individual book. It's a bunch of books. It's a library. What we call the Bible is actually a collection of individual historical documents that ancient historians do not just dismiss because they're under one cover. Sure, they may not believe everything they read in the Bible because of their own bias. I get it, but that doesn't mean they write the whole thing off.
No, it's not that they don't believe it because of their own bias. It's because when you take an honest look at the Bible, the individual books in the Bible, when those books were written and what what their sources were, you find out that ultimately, as far as Jesus' story goes, it all depends on Paul's writings. Paul is the only independent sources within the Bible. So you can't use, like the Gospels, you can't depend on them because they are devoid of any historical sourcing. They are not biographies that are based on real events. They are theological narratives.
The reality is, within the biblical text, we have reliable historical evidence for Jesus, just like Bible scholar and agnostic Bart Ehrman said. In fact, speaking of the Apostle Paul, Bart says,
one author that we know about knew Jesus' brother and knew Jesus' closest disciple, Peter. He's an eyewitness to both Jesus' closest disciple and his brother.
There you have it.
Well, no, Bart's actually wrong here because Paul never indicates that Peter was a disciple of Jesus, just an apostle of Jesus. So he's kind of overstepping a little bit there, which kind of highlights how flippant he is with his historical knowledge about Paul's writings. Another thing is that the brother passage is highly contested. I have plenty of videos here on the channel that I will have in the description where I completely discuss the brother of the Lord passage. It does not indicate that this James was his literal blood brother, but more likely a fictive kinship type of brother, like just another general Christian. There's a lot of apologists out there that really hang their hat on this particular evidence. But the important thing to know is that James was a general Christian, not a literal blood brother, and Peter was never indicated to be a disciple. In fact, Paul never indicates anybody as a disciple in any of his writings. So it's an overstep to suggest that this Peter was actually a disciple of Jesus.
So what have we learned? First, the claim that we have no historical documentation for Jesus' existence outside the Bible is just plain false.
No, it's not. That's actually accurate. Paul's writings are the only independent writings that we have about Jesus. So there's no external sources that independently testify to Jesus' existence.
Authors like Tacitus, Josephus, and Lucian, and many others, all make reference to a historical Jesus.
No, they don't. I covered this earlier, so I'm not going to reiterate myself, but each one of those do not establish that Jesus existed in history.
Second, even if we didn't have any extra biblical evidence, so what? We still have reliable historical documentation from early witnesses collected together in a book that we now call the Bible.
No, we don't. There's no eyewitness accounts in the Bible whatsoever. The Gospels are definitely not eyewitness accounts. They were not written by eyewitnesses. They were not informed by eyewitnesses. Paul definitely wasn't an eyewitness because he only ever attests to a celestial Jesus and reading the scriptures a little too much. So no, none of that is true.
Only a blind-eyed bias against the Bible would dismiss this early evidence for Jesus.
You see, it's very obtuse and disingenuous to suggest that you have to be completely biased against the Bible in order to not consider the Bible as evidence that Jesus existed. That makes no sense to me whatsoever as to why you would say it, because that's not representative of how people characterize the Bible in this particular context. So I really just cannot be convinced that you are sincere in saying that.
Though popular on the internet, the idea that Jesus never existed completely ignores the facts.
No, it's not just popular on the internet. Currently there are 2 peer-reviewed books that have no rival in the scholarly field. So, for you to say that is just flat out wrong.
In the introduction to Bart Ehrman's book, Did Jesus Exist?, he says, "I am not a Christian, and I have no interest in promoting a Christian cause with a Christian agenda. I am an agnostic with atheist leanings. But as a historian, I think evidence matters, and the past matters. And for anyone to whom both evidence and the past matter, a dispassionate consideration of the case makes it quite plain Jesus did exist.
Technically, Bart Ehrman's a textual critic, not exactly a historian, although I would say that his area of expertise is very beneficial when considering like the Gospels and how they changed over time and all this other stuff. Like the history surrounding the Gospels, I think, is very important in his field. But as far as calling himself a historian, I'm a little apprehensive about saying that. But I ultimately don't care whether or not Jesus existed in history. I'm just not convinced by the evidence. That's all. I don't want Jesus not to exist. Even if Jesus did exist in history, that really doesn't shake any of my other beliefs or non-beliefs. It really doesn't matter to me as a person whether or not he existed. But I'm not convinced by the evidence, and that's why I'm so passionate about this subject.
Those who care about evidence follow the facts rather than dismiss them. The evidence is right there before their eyes if they just open them up and look. Class dismissed.
Well, no, I've opened my eyes to the evidence, and that's why I don't believe that he existed. In fact, it was when I was closing my eyes to the evidence that I believed he existed in the past. Because at one point, I was like, surely there's evidence. Yeah, Jesus existed. And then I actually opened my eyes and looked at the evidence and the facts, and I became convinced that he probably didn't. Well, thank you, heathens, for joining me today. I really appreciate you taking a look at Tim's video with me. If you will, leave me a comment down below with what you thought about Tim's video. Do you think that he brought solid evidence here, or do you think that this evidence is the same shit that we've heard time and time again? Let me know down in the comments. Hey, while you're down there, why don't you smash that like button and subscribe if you like this kind of content. Don't forget to stand up and use your voice. Bye, heathens!